So, do you want to prevent pulling your hamstring? Well, this video is 7 tips on how to just do that. Now, we all know prevention is better than cure, but with the hamstring this is even more important. The research shows that if you've previously pulled your hamstring, then you're 33% more likely to do it again in the future. So obviously it's really important to try and prevent this in the first place. Tip 1, correct warm up. Now, it's really important to warm the muscles up. Obviously, if your muscles are cold, then you're going to tear them much more easily. This is very important though. Stretching itself isn't actually a warm-up. You could do dynamic stretching, which involves movement and motion, which then obviously will warm the muscles up. But static stretching is a bit of a no-go area. If you statically stretch, then it's not really warming the muscles up. It's an exercise of its own accord. The other thing is you may well actually increase your injury risk. It's a debatable area, but certainly we know that there's a reduction in power output after static stretching, which can last for up to 15 minutes. So really, the warm-up needs to include motions that start you slowly and build you up more and more and more to higher speed and higher velocity, which are akin to what you're going to be doing actually as the sport you're about to do. So obviously, if it involves twisting and turning, you've got to involve twisting and turning motions, so on and so forth. Tip 2, strengthen the gluteus maximus. So this is your big bum muscle, basically. So the reason this is important is the hamstring and the gluteus maximus muscle both extend the hip joints. So obviously if you're running forwards, yes, you're going to be flexing the knee, but also you're going to be extending the hip joint. Well, obviously if one of the muscles that extends the hip joint is weak, namely gluteus maximus, then you're going to actually have problems because the hamstring is going to have to take up the slack. It's going to have to work harder and compensate for the lack of strength that's in the gluteus maximus. So a great exercise for gluteus maximus, we know from EMG studies, is hip thrusts. And there is a video that I've done previously on hip thrusts, so you can have a look at that here. Tip 3, Nordic hamstring curls, particularly eccentric variety, which is where the muscle is under load and lengthening at the same time. Well, this is where a lot of hamstrings get torn, is under load and lengthening at the same time. So you want to strengthen the muscle in that kind of way. That's exactly what an eccentric Nordic hamstring curl will do. There is a video that I've done on eccentric Nordic hamstring curls, and again, you can have a look at that here. So what does the research say about eccentric Nordic hamstring curls? Well, there's lots of research. In fact, it's the big thing at the moment. They found reduction in injury in soccer players. They found that if you do eccentric Nordic hamstring curls, then you're actually less likely to pull your hamstring as a reoccurrence by 85%. Well, as we spoke before about the 33% likelihood of redoing it again, well, if you can reduce that by 85%, then you're technically less likely to do it than you were in the first place. So eccentric Nordic hamstring curls is a must. Tip 4, flexibility. Obviously, if your hamstrings are too short for the activity you need, then you're more likely to overstretch them, which is obviously going to potentially tear them, whether it be cumulative or obviously in a one-off go. So it's really important that you look at the sports you do and the activities you do. You need to work out whether you are deficient in the range for that sport, because it isn't a one-size-fits-all rule. A gymnast is going to need more flexibility than a powerlifter, for example. So you've got to look at what you need. There's no point having too much, but there again, if you haven't got enough, you're likely to injure yourself. And again, research shows that people who've had injured hamstrings have got shorter hamstrings on the torn side. Now, I know you could say chicken or the egg with this, and it's very true, but obviously there is food for thought there. The other thing that's really important is the research also shows that you're more likely to take longer to recover from a stretching type injury in the hamstring than a load type from, say, sprinting. So it's very important on that basis. If you want to prevent that type of injury, then you've got to make sure you've got the flexibility required. Tip 5, correct movement patterns. If you're not moving correctly and your technique is wrong, then you're more likely to injure yourself. So again, if you're not utilizing the muscles in the correct way and not firing them in the right way, maybe in the wrong range of motion, perhaps if you're running with more leaning forward position from the trunk and the hips, you're putting more stretch into certain muscles and so on. And research shows that if you work on dysfunctional movement patterns within sport, and this, sometimes you've got to do some video analysis to realize this, unless you've got a coach who can really spot on eyeball it. Well, you're more likely to recover faster from hamstring injuries if you work on movement pattern dysfunction. Tip 6, not overtraining. Hamstrings are a large group of muscles, and basically there's a correlation with recovery time with the size of muscles. So obviously if you've got big hamstrings for yourself as well, then obviously you're going to need a bit longer. I mean, some of the big bodybuilder guys would train legs and hamstrings and quads therefore maybe once a week because they would be crippled by it, and therefore they need to recover, repair, and replenish, and then they can start again. For the average person though, I would say maybe 2 to 3 times a week is probably the upper limit maybe even 2 times a week. So obviously you've got to make sure that you're recovering well. If you're not recovering well, you're building up cumulative injury and eventually it's going to go. Tip 7, alignment and posture. Obviously, if you've got any alignment issues and postural issues, this could change the way the length tension ratio of the hamstrings actually is. So for example, if you've got a long leg, that could create a PI ilium on one side, which rotates the pelvis, which moves the attachment of the hamstring tendon. The other thing is, with that side of the coin, you could be putting more pressure through one leg, and that's going to make that hamstring work harder. If you stand on one leg, clearly the muscles on that side have to work harder. So if you've got 75% of your weight on one leg, obviously that's going to have to work harder. So you've got to look at alignment, posture, things like that as well. It's more of a contentious issue, but it is something that if you want to really pull out all the stops, then it's something to work on as well.